Hey gang, it is Wednesday, late afternoon, evening, and I'm going to record a lesson for you from chapter 11 out of the AMSCO book. Mine's falling apart, tearing the pages out. I read through it myself and then did a little review. I've got my PowerPoint lesson that I was going to share with you guys loaded up here on my computer. I'm going to make copies of that PowerPoint and make it available to you tomorrow. So I'll try to print them off in the morning before school starts and then just come on in and grab it. You can use it to study for Friday's exam. You're not required to watch this video, but it will be helpful. It'll be useful since I'm the one that wrote, well, I put the test together. Some of the questions are mine. And so I have taught this lesson from the Phoner book, the Give Me Liberty book, and I've also taught it out of the AMSCO book. And the AMSCO book does a pretty good job of narrowing down the specific reformers that you need to know. There's obviously hundreds, if not thousands of them. And they riddled off a whole bunch of them pretty quickly, but they did seem to kind of circle around the ones that the Eric Phoner book brought to our attention, and also the ones that Heimler and others mentioned. So I'm going to go through my PowerPoint and do a quick summary of all of this. There were some videos that I was going to show you, and we won't have time to do that. One of them was on Joseph Smith, the Mormon leader. Another one was on, I can't remember his name. Wow. Garrison, the abolitionist. So anyway, there are two that Mr. Heimler did specifically about the Reform movement and the Second Great Awakening that I will include when I upload this particular video that I think you should watch. It will be beneficial. So anyway, all right, so chapter 11 jumps into several reform movements, the first being the Second Great Awakening. I'm going to read off my slide. I'm looking over at my computer. I have a couple of puppies in the room with me, and so if they start barking, I'm sorry. Sometimes they start barking because they hear a noise and I can't get them to be quiet, so I apologize ahead of time. So, all right, so the era of the Reform movement, which is period for 1800 to 1848. Let me look and see what the chapter says. Actually, it says 1820 to 1860 is when the Reform movements really began. Was a period of time that an American identity was really forming. Prior to this era, that we were, Anglicization, we were very much like our British cousins across the ocean, a lot of the things that reflected our immigrant heritage. But during the middle of the 1800s, coupled with the Reform movements and the Second Great Awakening, America began to kind of form its own identity, not just based upon patriotism and nationalism, but we began to create our own sorts of artwork. Our own painters, a lot of the painters of this era painted scenes from nature or just everyday domestic things that people would be doing in their homes. Authors, the Transcendentalist, the lady that wrote Little Women, why am I forgetting her name? Alcott, Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. Those were all truly American artists and American writers that reflected kind of an American way of life that was different than the rest of the world. I'm trying to think what else they mentioned in there. Even the religious expressions of this era are uniquely American. Even Mormonism is uniquely American. And so anyway, I'm going to zip through my PowerPoint. I'll be looking over at my computer periodically just to kind of get my bearings, and I'm going to go as fast as I can. It won't be like we're sitting in class. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter than if we were sitting in class. So what was the Second Great Awakening? It really was a pushback against the ideas of Puritanism and Calvinism. It was a broad umbrella attitude towards salvation. It swung the pendulum the other direction, whereas the Puritans said there's just a few elect. The Second Great Awakening said that everybody can come and be saved, no matter what their background is and how little faith they have. But they did interject the idea that through faith and hard work, you can earn your way to heaven. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a evangelical-based revival. While there were evangelicals that were a part of it, it was really more of an emotional expression of religion that pushed back against Calvinism. So I'm going to read through my my bullet points here. The Second Great Awakening was a populist movement, which basically means it was it affected everywhere in the country. It was amongst the popular people. The populist, just the everyday Joe. Everybody experienced it from the north to the south, but it did get its roots. It really started largely in upstate New York, in the countryside. Whenever you see New York, don't automatically think New York City. New York was a state, and so oftentimes when there's a reference to New York, it's talking about the state and not the city. In this case, there were areas of Western New York, kind of rural areas, that were referred to as the burnt out districts, because the Second Great Awakening would draw people in with these big tent revivals. People would come from everywhere. It was lots of emotional expression, campfires, hellfire and brimstone preaching. Charles Finney was probably the most well-known Second Great Awakening revival preacher, and he fine-tuned the art of hell and damnation type of preaching. That's where the word the burnt out district comes from. Also out of this Second Great Awakening, Mormonism was birthed. I won't go into all the details of it, although it's a fascinating story and fascinating take. I personally think that Mormonism is, I think Joseph Smith, who is the founder of Mormonism, was probably a con artist. However, Mormons today don't believe that. Obviously, they believe he was a very righteous man. But Mormonism was birthed out of the Second Great Awakening. It became a denomination of sorts, along with other denominations that were growing at that time. There were some obviously big differences between the Mormons, the Baptists, the Methodists. The Baptists and the Methodists became the two largest Protestant denominations in the country during this era. Mormonism grew pretty rapidly. I'm surprised how many people accepted the teachings of Joseph Smith. Actually, in the AMSCO book, it refers to the Book of Mormon as scripture with a capital S, and I found that a little bit offensive when I saw that. The Book of Mormon is not scripture. It's not inspired by the Holy Spirit. I think what they meant was it's their scripture. Mormons do follow the teachings of the Bible, and they also have this other revelation they call the Book of Mormon that supposedly was delivered to Joseph Smith, and it's a lot of their teachings are based upon the Book of Mormon, even more so than the Bible. But Joseph Smith, according to AMSCO, was murdered. It was more than that. He and his brother, as his community moved from town to town trying to avoid persecution, people thought he was odd. They felt it was cult-like. He had multiple wives. He didn't just have two wives. He had multiple wives. As did other people, other men in his community. And there were some people that printed some contrary articles about him. And so he and his brother and some other Mormons went into the printing company, burned it to the ground, and then there was a warrant for his arrest that was issued. He was put on house arrest. There were other things, but that was the primary thing. And a mob surrounded the building where he and his brother and others were being held on house arrest. They, my understanding is they also had rifles, and a gun battle ensued in which Joseph Smith and his brother were both killed. After that, the power for the church was transferred to Brigham Young. Ultimately, Brigham Young and the community moved out to Utah, where they settled near the Salt Lake area, called it New Zion, and that's where they established themselves. The book says that they outlawed polygamy in 1890. That's largely because they could not become a state until they legally outlawed the practice of polygamy, and they agreed to do so in exchange for earning statehood out in the state of Utah. And anyway, so you do need to know that Mormonism was birthed out of the Second Great Awakening. Also Seventh-day Adventist. There was, during this period of time, there was a great focus on the return of Jesus. When was he going to come back? When was the rapture going to happen? The group that ultimately came out of this movement as well was the Seventh-day Adventists. I don't know if you guys know much about them. I know we used to play the Seventh-day Adventist school out in Gentry. I think we still do. But anyway, so Baptists, Methodists, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, they all kind of came out. Somebody's sending me something. Oh, the message, I can ignore it. There's a picture on the PowerPoint that I will leave on there. One of them is a picture of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. It's probably not Joseph Smith. Nobody knows for sure what Joseph Smith looked like, but early in their history, someone used this painting, which was a painting of a legislator in one of the Midwestern states, we think, and presented it as Joseph Smith. So we don't really know what he looks like, but that's what Mormons say he looks like. And then there's also a picture of Charles Finney, and he's got crazy eyes. He's balding, he's got a crazy beard, and he looks the part. So, okay, also part of the Reform movement were the authors known as the Transcendentalists, and they weren't just authors, but primarily authors. Transcendentalists were people that sort of they took parts of the Enlightenment and the idea that we can reason, we can think, and they coupled it with love of nature, and that nature and being outdoors is an expression of God. And it was also a pushback and a cry to slow down and not get wrapped up in the materialistic society of the market revolution. People who were transcendentalists tended to be big thinkers. They didn't like the idea that the marketplace industry was taking up so much of people's time, and the desire to earn money and to make something of yourself seemed to sweep through the nation. And so transcendentalists were like, whoa, hold on. You need to remember who you are. You need to get back out into nature. They were about individualism and being who you were made to be and expressing yourself in various ways. They did also embrace largely the anti-abolition movement. The anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement. A lot of the transcendentalists were opposed to slavery and spoke out very eloquently about it. Their writings are very difficult for me to read. I think we watched a John Green video where he was like, "Oh no, not Emerson or Thoreau." I can't remember which one. So Ralph Waldo Emerson is probably the most famous transcendentalist. I'm going to ask Miss Gray to do a little bit of a unit on the transcendentalists with you guys in the next couple weeks if she has time. And then Henry David Thoreau is another one of the transcendentalists. Both of these two men lived in Concord, Massachusetts. They lived near Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. And they were all part of kind of a writers guild. But Henry David Thoreau decided to put his money where his mouth was, and he went and lived at Walden Pond for 2 years, and he grew his own food, and he hunted, and he wrote about the experience of being self-sufficient and being outside of that money-making market revolution. He basically became his own little communal living area. But anyway, that's probably his most famous book, Walden. He also wrote a book called On Civil Disobedience. And so during the Mexican-American War, which we haven't even talked about yet, which was in, let me think about this, 1845, 1846, he believed that it was an unconstitutional war, an immoral war that was started by our president, which it probably was. So he refused to pay the war tax in Concord, and he was put in jail for a while. So he introduced the idea of peaceful civil disobedience for those things that are important to you. There's a couple pictures there of them. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau are the two primary transcendentalists. Alcott's not really a transcendentalist. Her writing is more entertaining, more novelish. And she was doing it to make money for her family. Women had very few opportunities at that time to make money unless they married into money. If you've seen Little Women, you know the story, that she was friends with them, and I believe she's also buried in the same cemetery that they are. She never did marry. All right, also during the Reform era, there were a number of utopian societies that came about. The book says there were thousands of them, and just kind of briefly mention the main ones. Probably the first one that will oftentimes jump out of a book is a group called the Shakers. And just like the Quakers, they physically shook and expressed themselves in various emotional expressions during worship. They were extreme in that they believed that almost the institution of marriage and sex was sinful. And so they decided that in their communities where they all lived together, that men and women would live separately and they would not allow marriage. The only way they could proliferate their little community was to adopt children. So orphans were brought into the community, but a lot of times they did, when they grew up, they didn't stay in the community. They went off and got married and had their own lives. So they tried to practice what the Bible talks about, sharing all things in common. But obviously God also instituted the idea of marriage, and God gives the creation mandate for mankind to control the world, to rule the world, and they didn't want to do that. So anyway, they eventually phased out. There are no more Shaker communities, but there was a period of time where they made. One of the ways they made money was they made furniture. So just like the Amish today, sometimes people will order or purchase homemade Amish furniture or Mennonite furniture. The Shakers did that as well. And if you ever were able to get your hands on a piece of Shaker furniture, it's probably pretty valuable. It is a true antique. And then there were the Owenites. The Shakers were based on religious expression or religious ideas, biblical ideas. Anna Lee was the founder of that. But I'm trying to look here, the Owenites, the Oneidites, and other organizations were secular based, sometimes almost science fiction based. In fact, which one was this? The Oneida community or communal utopian community made silverware, real expensive silverware. In fact, when I was growing up, to have Oneida silverware was like, you have Oneida? There was a company called Oneida based on that, I believe. But they were kind of super weird. They basically practiced eugenics. They allowed people to share marriage partners to come up with the perfect looking child, blonde hair, blue eyes, and it got real weird. And so it was not I would say a utopian society that was looked on as, oh, isn't that sweet? It was considered kind of abnormal. What else? There are a couple pictures in the PowerPoint that I will leave when I make copies of it. I don't always make these copies of you, of the Shakers in their services. They would have these dances, which is kind of funny because the men and women weren't allowed to dance together. So essentially what you had were line dances. You'd have lines of women facing lines of men, and they're all doing these dances, but they're not really dancing with each other. They're just dancing in lines. So anyway, that was part of their community, these very expressive dances. There's a picture there. There's actually a real photograph of an Oneida community and the buildings that they lived in, and most of the people look highly educated, and you can see them out in the lawn talking, and there's also a picture of their silverware. Let's see here. Okay, the arts, literature, expression of American culture. Mr. Heimler, in one of the other videos I'm going to suggest that you watch, talks about this. But during this reform era, Americans began to also build their structures in a very American way that borrowed classic Greek, like the columns and those sorts of things. If you go through certain towns or capitals or county squares, a lot of the structures have these huge columns, very Greek-esque type architecture, and that was very, very common during that era. One of the things that is really, really important, the Hudson School of Art was a group out of New York, artists that would paint nature scenes, and they were very, very popular with the transcendentalists and loving nature and all of that. Thomas Cole started the Hudson River School, and their paintings were quintessential American frontier, American outdoorsmen. They even painted each other in some of the paintings. And so there is actually a painting at Crystal Bridges. Let me see if I've got a picture of it. It's called Kindred Spirits. And it was painted by Asher Brand Durand, and he was a very famous Reform era painter. He was from the Hudson River School of Art. And he painted Thomas Cole in the painting along with somebody else after he had passed away, to pay homage to him. And Alice Walton bought that painting, I think, from a New York art gallery, and she paid $35 million for it. It was one of the first uber expensive paintings at Crystal Bridges. And I remember when it was first displayed, I always thought it was a painting of Lewis and Clark. It looks like a picture of Lewis and Clark out in the frontier, but it's actually from the Hudson River School of Art. So anyway, I want to just take note of that. When we go to Crystal Bridges in about 3 weeks or so, we're going to specifically hunt down that picture. They used to have a piece of plexiglass in front of it. Last time I was there, I don't think it had the plexiglass in it. There are paintings that go through Crystal Bridges, sometimes are borrowed from the Met and stuff, that are worth more than that, which is crazy. But at the time, it was the most expensive piece of art in Crystal Bridges. If I get a chance, I will look that up and see what the case is now. But anyway, the Hudson River School of Art is quintessential American identity or American culture that was evolving during this time. Also, the book, and also mention a couple of other authors that are American authors that are really part of the American identity of this time. And one of them was Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I think you guys are actually going to read one of his works. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're going to do... I think you were going to, but they switched it. Anyway, I think you're going to read something similar to it. But Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter. Maybe you guys did that last year. No, that was Mrs. Van Dam last year. Anyway, if you recall, people were walking around with letters pinned to their shirts. So The Scarlet Letter is a story about a girl who is demonized because of her sin, and she has to wear a letter, or she wears a letter and basically tells the world that she is a prostitute, basically. And anyway, Nathaniel Hawthorne, if I remember correctly, he also wrote Seven Gables of Seven Gables. That's what it is, which is a story about the Puritans of New England, and kind of a spooky story around this house that was has some sort of curse put on it. It's situated right outside of Salem, Massachusetts. I've had the privilege of actually touring the house, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, his maybe great-grandfather was one of the judges in the Salem witch trials, and Nathaniel Hawthorne heard stories about all of these things, so he wrote this really kind of spooky story. He changed the spelling of his name. He added an E to the end of his name because he did not want to be associated with the Salem witch trials and his family's name, so he changed the spelling of his name. Another writer of this era that's outside of the Transcendentalist was Herman Melville. He writes a story you probably have heard of called Moby Dick. Some of you have maybe seen some of the modern renditions of it. It's been put to the screen a few times. It's not a book that I've ever read. I think it's a pretty monstrosity of a book, but very interesting, I am told. I'm not as well read as I would like to be. So Moby Dick, Scarlet Letter, what else we got here? All right, some of the specific reform movements of this era, the most important one or the largest one was the temperance movement, the movement to essentially shame and outlaw the use of alcohol. Alcoholism was pretty off the charts during this era, coupled with the fact that women didn't have a whole lot of legal rights. A lot of women suffered extensively in abusive homes, and so naturally a lot of the leaders of the temperance movement were women who were trying to reform the family unit, and the men who were drinking excessively. And whiskey and other alcoholic beverages were very cheap during this era. So for the common guy working in the factory who wasn't making a whole lot of money, it was cheap entertainment, which unfortunately led to a lot of domestic abuse. And so over the course of time, this movement picked up speed, and it became the largest reform movement of the era. And there were actually, I can't remember if it was, I don't think it was Massachusetts. There was some New England state that completely outlawed the sale and consumption of alcohol. And then there were, I believe the book says 11 or 12 states that followed suit by the eve of the Civil War, but then slavery kind of took everybody's attention off of the temperance movement until later in our history when the sale and consumption of alcohol was completely outlawed with the Constitutional Amendment. There was also reform movements within the prisons, mental asylums, and schools for the blind and the deaf. A couple of names that are really important to remember. One of them is a lady by the name of Dorothea Dix, D-I-X. She wrote extensively about the condition of mentally ill patients or people who were incarcerated with violent criminals in destitute situations and were not receiving any sort of medical help. And so she started a movement to separate the mentally ill from incarcerated people and actually have physical buildings and medical buildings where they could tend to them and try to help them. And that took off, and that's kind of the status quo today. We don't put mentally ill people, generally speaking, in a incarcerated prison situation. A lot of the people that are on the streets, homeless people who are dealing with various problems, a lot of them are just mentally ill. They need help, and they turn to drugs to medicate themselves, and it just compounds the problem. And so a lot of those people could be helped if they could receive medical treatment. The other person that you need to be familiar with is a guy by the name of Horace Mann, M-A-N-N. He is a villain in the Christian education circles, but in the public school circles, he's called the father of the public school, a modern public school system. He believed that every state should have compulsory or required public schools for kids from, whatever age to whatever age. It changed over time, but a minimum of, 6 or 7 years of education. He believed it should be taxpayer funded, and that kids should receive education, like reading, writing, and arithmetic, and moral teachings. He believed that society would be helped by that. Christian education advocates, a lot of the things that Horace Mann said, basically that it's the state's responsibility to raise up moral citizens. That parents should essentially give them over to the state to raise them, and of course that doesn't fly in Christian circles. So where we're supposed to be in partnership with families and helping basically reinforce the morals and principles that are being taught in the home and in their church. But anyway, Horace Mann, he's out of Massachusetts, another Massachusetts man, very important. There's a picture of him as well. During this reform movement, women began to have opportunities to gain higher secondary and higher education, college degrees. There were a couple of schools. One of them was Oberlin College, which I think is where John Green of Crash Course History attended school. So there were a couple schools, slow but surely, were offering higher education to women. Of course, the anti-slavery movements is a huge reform movement. There were several different stages of anti-slavery movements. The first one, which is mentioned, was the American Colonization Society, and it was a reform movement with mixed motives, I guess you could say. There were some people that thought that we owed it to Black Americans who were either enslaved or free, to allow them to go back to Africa where their family was from. And so for some people, that the motive was to pay back the harm that had been wrong that had been done. For others who didn't, that felt like the whites were racially superior to the Blacks, they believed that they didn't want to, how shall I say, they didn't want the problem of free Blacks in our country, and so they wanted Blacks to go back to Africa, which, terrible motives. A lot of Blacks that were free were like, I'm not African. I was born here in Boston, or I was born here in Philadelphia. I don't have any family in Africa. That's not my home. This is my home. And so, but it was the beginnings of the anti-slavery movement. The next one that was mentioned was the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, who I was trying to think of earlier. And he started a newspaper called The Liberator, and he really was the face of the immediate abolition movement. He believed that in every state, in every situation, no matter whether it's in the South Plantation System or in Pennsylvania, that anybody who was enslaved should be immediately emancipated, freed, and that there should be no recompense to the owners of the slaves, and he even believed in the right of Black male Americans to have the right to vote. And so obviously, in a perfect situation, that would have been awesome, but the reality is that people weren't there, their hearts weren't there, and it was not going to happen. And so no matter how loudly he screamed and yelled, and no matter how many constitutions he burned up, that wasn't going to happen. Unfortunately, it took a civil war to immediately emancipate the slaves, unfortunately, and then it took several years for the country to figure out how to safely allow Black Americans, male Americans, to vote. And then when they finally figured it out, then Jim Crow era swept in and refused them the right to vote. So there was a lot of ugly that happened that preceded the emancipation of Black Americans. So There are several Black abolitionists that you need to be familiar with. Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous. He and William Lloyd Garrison worked as a team for a while, but even to Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison was a little extreme. He was uncomfortable, I think, with him burning the Constitution. He believed that the Constitution could be used, or the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence could be used to highlight the inconsistencies in America's attitudes towards Black Americans. Frederick Douglass was, after he left William Lloyd Garrison's organization, he started a newspaper called the North Star. Harriet Tubman, of course, famously famous member of the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth was a former slave who had gained her freedom, and she would share her story like Frederick Douglass did as she toured the country. Sojourner Truth, I think that was the name. She changed her name, I believe. I can't remember what her original name was. David Walker was a Black minister who promoted violent abolitionism. Essentially, he would preach from his pulpit that Black Americans, slaved and free, should take up arms against the slave owners and basically start a civil war. So that was considered violent abolitionism. Oh, let's see here. Okay, I think I got through most of it. There are some pictures associated with all of this. Oh, there's one more slide. Oh, this is kind of an important one. Okay, the very last part of the chapter introduces you to the ideas of what today we would refer to as the modern feminist movement. As women began to have access to education and find ways to have a voice, whether in print or with other reform organizations, most female or feminists got their start working in the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. So they found a place and a way to use their voice, and it empowered them to then take that reform movement on to try to shed light on the inequities of life for women and life for men. And so some of the ones that you definitely need to be familiar with are, we all know, I think, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I'm sorry. Where did they go? Susan B. Anthony, and who's the other one? Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Yeah, those are two ladies that I think when I was a little girl in grade school, those two names came up a lot. They were involved early on trying to fight for women's right to vote. But the event that you need to be familiar with, which I would say AP, College Board, the people who write the questions and whatnot are probably have a liberal bent. And so you are very likely going to see questions and essays based upon things that we see as kind of peripheral, but they think are really, really important, or like core right in the middle. I would say George Washington is in the middle. They would say